Hello, my name is Stuart Evans. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon, Silicon Valley. My research is on the subject of flexibility, how we can do things differently under circumstances as they change. I developed this concept with Professor Homer Barami at Berkeley Business School called super flexibility. Flexibility is a complex polymorphous concept that has many different meanings. It can mean on the one hand being resilient or robust. It can mean on the other hand being agile or versatile. It's a very important capability in Silicon Valley. In fact, many would allude to it as the secret sauce of Silicon Valley, how companies dynamically adapt to change at very high clock speed. So we'll talk a little bit in this presentation about the Silicon Valley ecosystem and how it works. We'll talk a little bit about what super flexibility is, and then we'll apply it to a rubric about how successful startups function. I hope you enjoy the presentation. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me here with you today. My talk today is about super flexible innovation, and it's a perspective from Silicon Valley. The talk has three different themes. I'd first of all like to talk about Silicon Valley as a super flexible ecosystem. I'd then like to go on and talk a little bit about how super flexibility is the secret sauce of Silicon Valley. Thirdly, we'll talk about super flexible startups, which are the critical ingredients to the Silicon Valley ecosystem. So let me start with what the most imperative thing is in Silicon Valley. Change is a constant. In the old world, change was much slower, systematic. It's like a building. It stays there for a long time on solid foundations. In the new world, it's like whitewater rafting. It's very dynamic. Things change all the time. So we move from an environment where we stick to the plan and keep things as they are to an environment now where we have to make real-time adjustments. And how do we make real-time adjustments? What's the most important consideration? Well, in Silicon Valley, we have a very complex ecosystem. The ecosystem is comprised of many components. The knowledge generator clusters, which you can see on the slide, have developed over time, where we have the biotech industry, we have the disk drive industry, we have the telecommunications industry, we have the software industry, now the game industry. It's evolving very rapidly. And finally, we have the social network business and search business. That ecosystem is complemented by a number of academic institutions and research institutes which develop the technologies and the people to populate Silicon Valley. So we have a lot of different, what we call parts of the ecosystem here in Silicon Valley that all interact together to provide this very dynamic environment, which is a hotbed of startup creation and big company creation now. So what are the components of the Silicon Valley ecosystem? Well, we think there are four. We talk about this in our book. The first of them, and probably the most important, are the generators. The generators are large firms such as Apple, Google, Intel, IBM, Facebook, and Apple and Uber now, who all subcontract with smaller firms and generate a lot of technology and a lot of suppliers that work with them and subcontractors who specialize in a very small, tiny niche. These people are generated in terms of the technology from research at universities, from research institutes like Palo Alto Research Center that Xerox had, like Stanford Research Institute. And they develop engineers who have the technology, who provide it to these generators. So that's the second component. The third component are the hatcheries. And this is a really critical component. It's where venture capital firms, angel investors, accelerators now, and incubators provide the capability to educate and put entrepreneurs through boot camps to rapidly scale their startups using the kind of standard methodology of Silicon Valley. In fact, some of them do it offline in hackers clubs and homebrew clubs, so it's not all formalized. And then the third area are what I call the lubricants, or the catalysts. The catalysts are lawyers, accountants, real estate people, PR people, headhunters, who all specialize in various components of the ecosystem. And together, they create this rather unique ecosystem that we call Silicon Valley. So what happens in Silicon Valley is the second part of my talk. To be super flexible, it requires adapting to change as it occurs. And change occurs through what we call revision triggers. These revision triggers in startups are things like teams that fall apart. Most startups fall apart within the first year and have to be repotted and new management brought in. The second risk that people have to look to are market risks. Sometimes you'll develop a technology that looks great at a particular time, but the market might be eclipsed by another development a year and a half from now, so you have to look at these triggers. Probably the most visible one that's occurred in recent years is the taxi business. Uber has transformed the taxi business from what was a rather unpleasant experience 3 or 4 years ago with dirty taxis that didn't really have user-friendly drivers. Now it's a totally different system, so it transforms things very quickly. And not only is market risk a big problem, but technology risk is a big problem. The clock speed of innovation now is so rapid that even startups can fall behind on the technology risk. It takes about 9 months to incubate a startup, and in that time the technology can be developed to the point where it really is making what you have obsolete, and so you've always got to be aware of that and work with people that can help you look at that technology. And finally, financial risk. Financial risk is a big part of the radar screen for venture capitalists, because if a company looks like it's going to run out of money, that's the end of the game. And so running out of cash is the most difficult thing to deal with for startups in Silicon Valley, and that's the kind of risk that you look at. When you put all these things together, you get an environment which transforms rapidly in ways that you can't anticipate. So being super flexible is really important. And the ecosystem's climate is really interesting. In Silicon Valley, it thrives on collaborative partnerships and recombinant innovation, where technologies that were developed a couple of years ago are mixed with new technologies, and that creates a very different platform to work with. Probably the best example of that in the wearables area is Scully Helmets. They put together a crash helmet for motorcycles with cameras so you could see behind, with a heads-up display that was voice activated. The technologies themselves weren't original, but the combination was, and they've created a really disruptive force in that business. Silicon Valley is a highly goal-driven environment where people work very hard. There's a very strong work ethic, and it's like the Olympiad of mind work. So people really work very hard and try and accomplish their goals. One of the things that's really different about Silicon Valley from different parts of the world is that there are no safety nets. If you're out of business, you're gone in a couple of days. It's very Darwinian. And this Darwinian process actually helps to let the fittest and best startups grow more quickly, because when companies fail in a given area, the people who are laid off will migrate towards the successful companies and speed up the growth of the successful companies. So that actually is a very positive thing. Sometimes it's painful, and we have corrections and contractions periodically. During those times, many people go out of business, and it's a difficult thing to adjust to. But those cycles actually help the Valley, because it lifts the intellectual capital over time, because the people who are more fitted to this environment stay, and the people that are not suited to it have to go elsewhere and find jobs elsewhere. The founding goal or founding metaphor in the Valley, the narrative, is all about eternal optimism. Everybody thinks their startup is going to win, their startup is going to be the next home run, and that's going to find them their pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And that's really how Silicon Valley operates. So this section really kind of covers the different aspects of the Silicon Valley ecosystem, the climate, the components, and the different parts of the ecosystem. In the next session, I want to talk about super flexibility. Super flexibility really is the secret sauce of Silicon Valley. It's a subject which I've been researching for the last, well, it doesn't seem that long, but it's the last 30 years. My PhD was in this topic. So it's a subject to which I'm very committed to. Essentially, it means how you do things differently when you have to. It's easy to say, it's difficult to do. So let's look at some of the components of super flexibility. What is it? Well, it's about making sudden left turns. It's about remaining viable in future scenarios. It's about disrupting the equilibrium. It's about seizing the moment when presented. It's a complex term, but it means essentially how you dynamically adapt to change. And that's the ethos inside of Silicon Valley, and that's what makes it so effective. It changes very rapidly when data is presented, and people adjust accordingly. So how do we adapt to change? And where is super flexibility valued? If you look at the last, say, 100 years of research, on flexibility. It really started out at the University of Chicago in the 1930s. It was always seen as valuable in times of crisis. So the first scholars that looked at the topic were in Chicago at the business school in the 1930s, and they were trying to figure out a way to stimulate the economy to get out of the Great Depression. So they were looking at ways of doing things differently in order to create a new kind of enterprise. The other environment where it was prized was in times of hypergrowth, where things were just moving so quickly you didn't have time to adjust and you had to do it all on the fly. So really, super flexibility historically has been prized for survival in times of depression and downturns, and in times of upturns and thriving. Now it's a capability that we need all the time. So what are the different modes of adaptation? Well, it's best to look at the animal kingdom to see how animals adapt. So if you look at the slide, we first of all see the crocodile. The crocodile is the oldest creature surviving on Earth now, and it does so because its gastrointestinal tract has evolved to the point where it can eat anything. And so it can survive on land, on water. It's got strong armor, so it doesn't have many predators. And it can hunt with its specially adapted eyes that have a layer that comes over them, so it can see underwater. So the crocodile is really very robust. It can handle a lot of different conditions very, very effectively. And then if we look at a camel is a good example of an animal that's adapted for hostile conditions. It can survive in areas where there's no water because it stores the water in its hump. And that again is another mode of being robust in very hostile conditions and being able to survive effectively even though the things we need for life are not there. This is a very different type of flexibility that we see in the chameleon. The chameleon adapts to change by rapidly changing color to match its background. It does this to either hide from predators or to disguise itself in stalking prey. And so we have these two different modes where the color changes according to the background, and it does this real time. So that's another mode of adaptation. A further mode of adaptation is a snake. We all know that snakes kind of slither along the ground and are flexible that way, but they also shed their skin as they grow. And that is another kind of notion of flexibility, this ability to be malleable as you're wrapping yourself around a tree or moving along the ground. And so we have a further sense of flexibility. When we look at a starfish, what comes to mind? Well, it's a beautiful creature, but it does something that's quite unique. When it loses a limb, when it gets chopped off or attacked, it can regrow that limb. And regrowing severed parts is a really important capability. Many companies lose people quickly and they have to regrow in those departments. And so that ability to regenerate is another sense of flexibility in the way that companies adapt. The final example here is that of the cheetah. The cheetah has evolved to the point where it has one single prey, and it has optimized its hunting regime to be able to rapidly accelerate to catch the antelopes. So these are the different modes of adaptation that we see in nature. So how do we synthesize from these to think about what super flexibility might be in terms of how we adapt to change? So as we can see, super flexibility is a spectrum. It goes from the robust crocodile that can survive in any conditions, to the resilient starfish that can regrow itself, to a camel that's hedging its bets. If I don't find water, I've got it on my back, I don't need it. So that's another different type of flexibility. Modularity is a really key type of flexibility, just like in a beehive, because it enables you to reproduce very quickly at scale. And then we saw in the cheetah this notion of being agile, and in the case of the chameleon, being versatile. It can change its background, the color to whatever background it's with, instantaneously. So really super flexible adaptation at the end of the day is about ease of modification when we confront different situations than we anticipated. It means on the one hand withstanding pressures, on the other hand it's about instantly transforming like a chameleon as it changes the color of its background. So we want to think about super flexibility as a spectrum going from one hand surviving, on the other hand thriving, from one hand withstanding pressures, on the other hand being instantly transformable. So this is what super flexibility is. Now, in essence, how we describe super flexibility is this ability to switch gears between different types. So When you're in an environment, say, like the chameleon on the slide, where there's lots of prey, you can exploit that very, very rapidly by eating lots of insects that you find. If you're in an environment where you have to correct a situation, you need to do it quickly and regrow. Or you might be in a situation where you find yourself like a cheetah, where you want to rapidly accelerate. And finally, you might want to protect yourself with IP. For example, you want to protect that, so you want to be like a camel. You want to be able to store useful things for later application. So really, at the end of the day, we need to shift between this different modes. So flexibility really is all about shifting gears according to what's appropriate in a given circumstance. So what does it mean for companies? What does super flexibility mean in a company? Well, my background, I worked in the venture capital business from 1985 to 1990. It was a time when we didn't have Gmail, and email was kept for personal use, and you certainly couldn't put big attachments on email. So most of the business plans that came into our office came by mail or hand-delivered as big physical documents. And I was a junior person in the office, so it was my job to screen all the business plans. And we used to get a couple of hundred business plans a week, which amounted to a fair amount of work to kind of go through them. So my desk on a Monday morning would have two big piles, and I'd have to go through them and see which companies were worth looking at. So after a few weeks, it came to me that we should have a system for kind of working this out. How do you screen these business plans for the ones that you want to escalate and look further at and maybe make an investment? So I came up with a little ruse to say that, what are the success factors that we're looking for, and how should I find that? And so the 3 U's was something that I developed as a screening mechanism for looking at business plans and looking at companies. So what are these 3 U's? You might stop and think for a minute. What is a U that applies to the technology business? Well, the 3 U's are very simple. The first thing that you need for any business are urgent customer needs. People need to really want something and resonate with something, and hopefully want it more than once. They want a repeat business. So that's the first U. The second U is that they need a unique technology or service. It's got to be something that's highly differentiated. And so that's the product or service that they're offering. It's got to be distinctive and highly kind of recognizable that it comes from this particular company. And the third and final one, and the most important one, is a unified team. Most startups, entrepreneurs are teams, they're not individuals. And a team of entrepreneurs works in a very high pressure environment, and oftentimes they come under extreme conditions that they have to work out together. It's like a football team or a military team. And so having a unified team is so important because you have to make lots of adjustments along the way. Super flexibility is the key to making these adjustments, but if you have a fragmented team, that doesn't happen as smoothly and as quickly, and you miss a lot of time and you lose a lot of customers accordingly. So the 3 U's of a viable startup are the things that I always look to, and I apply it to my students and my things. So what does it mean? Well, an urgent need is maybe a market opportunity that nobody's seen before. It could be a strategic partner that's asking for a particular technology. It could be a pain point that people have that's just not met right now, something that people are not aware of themselves, but when you show it to them, they really like that. You can see that in the way that Airbnb and Uber have grown so quickly in such a short period of time. And it's obvious when you see it, but until you see it, it's not that obvious. So the urgent need is the first and most important constituent that a successful startup needs to adapt and address. And needs evolve, they don't stay static. So once you've shown somebody something, they want more and more of a certain area, and you have to deliver that. What's important about a unified team? Well, the most important thing really is to have shared key values. You need everybody on the same page. So oftentimes you'll find teams get together that, for example, played poker on a Friday night regularly, and so they know each other, they know what other people's capabilities are. A good example of that is Box. That's the way that Aaron and his partner got Box going. There's another company called ROM that invented the PBX, where 4 of the founders used to play poker every Friday night, and that developed into a strong relationship. The most important part of a unified team is everybody feeling that things are fair. So stock allocation in a startup is based on contribution. So if somebody's a major contributor to the technology, they should be recognized. If somebody's a really good salesperson, they should be recognized. If somebody's an investor, they should be recognized too. And so it's really important to get that right combination when it comes to equity splits earlier on, so everybody feels like they're getting a fair crack of the representation. And then in startups, board representation is really important, but we'll go into that another time. The final U really refers to their unique product. And oftentimes this unique product is driven by design principles, understanding user requirements really, really well, and getting the right kind of user interface. It could be benchmarking competitive offerings, so you see that your product sort of sets itself out from the other offerings that are around. You look at the key differentiators, and most important, you look at its potential for scaling. It's okay building 5 or building 10, but can you build 1 million of these units? Can you build 10 million? Can you get 5 million users? Can you get 100 million users? Will the system be strong enough to cope with that? And I guess in a sense that's all kind of tied up in the value proposition. So a lot of these ideas are contained in a book that Homer and I wrote called Super Flexibility for Knowledge Enterprises. If any of you are interested, I'd be more than happy to send you an overview of that. I've gone through the presentation very quickly, but I really appreciate being invited to your conference, and I hope that this contribution was well received. Thank you.